hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here this evening. And thank you so much, Anessa, for, as always, putting on such an awesome research reception every year. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Kahn. I am a 6th-year PhD candidate here at the iSchool, co-advised by Jenna Burrell and Josh Blumenstock. And I'm super excited today to talk to you about some of my dissertation work that is based on fieldwork that I conducted in rural villages in Togo. And I should mention that this paper, the talk that I'll be giving is a sort of based on a paper that's under review at CSCW. And this is joint work with my collaborators, Karel Pere from Togo, Emily Aiken, Nitin Kohli, and also Josh Blumenstock. And Karel is actually online with us right now. I think it's like 11:30 at night for her. And she's unfortunately like not able to speak, but she's able to type. So if any of you guys have questions that you'd like her to kind of weigh in on, I encourage you to do that. And Karel, you should totally feel free to contribute on chat and we can read out whatever you think. Cool. So the plan for the next like 15 minutes or so is I'm going to first talk about how new data sources are both enabling new opportunities, but also raising new sorts of privacy concerns. I'm then going to talk a bit about the research questions that drove this work, which really seek to understand the privacy concerns of people living in rural villages in Togo. Talk about some of what we found from these interviews, then talk about some of the methods that we used around doing semi-structured interviews. And in particular, I want to highlight a new method that we developed that was sort of made all of this work possible. Then talk about what we learned from these interviews, and then end with a discussion about how the perspectives and experiences of people living in rural villages sort of compares or contrasts or places it in conversation with a lot of the privacy concerns that have been raised in the literature. So with that, let's jump in. I think this group knows pretty well that new data, big data, is increasingly being passively collected about people and about the world. And one piece of data that is being collected and the focus of my research is mobile phone metadata. And this is data that is sort of routinely collected by telecom companies. It looks something like this, and it contains information about phone calls. It contains information about text messages and mobile money transactions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with mobile money, it's sort of like Venmo, but it works on basic feature phones. And so this will be important later on. It collects data on it records data that's like the amount of money in an account, transfers that happen between people, the amount of money that's being transferred between people. And so all of this data and mobile phone data are really creating new opportunities and have been used to inform a wide range of development policies. So from improving lending decisions or determining lending decisions to pandemic response. And perhaps the work that many of us are probably most familiar with at the iSchool is some of the work that Josh and Emily have done to use mobile phone metadata to target cash transfers to people living in extreme poverty in rural Togo in response to the pandemic. And this is the kind of context and backdrop to some of the work that I've been doing. And at the same time that mobile phone data is enabling these new opportunities, it's also enabling or sort of reinvigorating these longstanding debates about privacy and raising some new privacy concerns. And many of the privacy concerns that it raises, in particular, mobile phone data raises these concerns around consent, the ability to obtain consent from people, the ways in which mobile phone data can enable surveillance by governments and corporations, very real challenges to anonymizing this data, and the ways in which mobile phone metadata in particular can challenge existing privacy laws. And as I've been looking at the literature, one of the things that really stuck out to me is that a lot of the work that's characterizing privacy concerns related to phone data is created and sort of based on work by people with domain expertise, people with expertise in sociology, legal studies, computer science, privacy, law, all of these other disciplines. And what really stuck out to me is that there was sort of notably absent this perspective and this experience of people who are often most impacted, or what some people sometimes call experiential experts. I think it's sort of worth pausing at this point and asking, does it matter? Does it matter? Do we need the perspectives and experiences of these experiential experts, or are we sort of fine with our understandings of the data privacy concerns arising from phone data really just coming from domain experts? Some people might argue and just say, domain experts, they've been trained, they know how to identify technical vulnerabilities, They know how to examine the law. And so maybe we don't need these experiential experts. Other people, on the other hand, might say lived experience surfaces really, really different types of privacy concerns. And we have a lot of reason to believe that privacy is contextual and also can look really different in different places and across different cultures. And so part of what I'm doing in this work is in some sense digging in a little bit to this sort of big question. So just to talk very specifically about some of the research questions motivating this work. So my research questions and my research takes place in Togo. For those of you who are not familiar, Togo is a pretty small country in West Africa with about 8 million people. And in the first research question, what I'm really interested in is understanding what privacy concerns arise for one group of experiential experts. In this case, people living in rural villages in Togo, specifically that arise from the use of mobile phone metadata. And then in the second question, we're then really interested in placing the privacy concerns raised by these experiential experts in some sense in conversation with the privacy concerns raised by these domain experts and asking, are they similar? Are they different? Do they show, how are they in conversation with one another? So again, I'm going to talk briefly about methods and talk specifically about one of this sort of new method that we developed in the process. As I mentioned, all of the research takes place in Togo. And it really unfolded in these 3 phases. So to understand the privacy concerns of people in rural villages in Togo, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 124 people living in rural villages. The research sort of unfolded in these 3 phases. And at a high level, interviewed participants were asked about sort of their privacy concerns specifically related to the use of mobile phone metadata. I do think it's important to note that some of these participants were asked questions about digital humanitarian aid, but the participants who were asked questions about data privacy were really only asked questions about data privacy. But just to kind of situate this within a broader research study, which is my dissertation. But we had this challenge, which is like, okay, we want to do these interviews with people living in rural villages in Togo. These are people, who have varying levels of formal education, varying levels of literacy. We want to specifically understand the privacy concerns that arise around mobile phone data. But there's this real challenge, right? Which is mobile phone data looks something like this. And so how do you communicate about something that looks like this in a way in which people living in rural villages in Togo can meaningfully weigh in and meaningfully provide input? And so what we did is we developed these really simple culturally relevant visuals that enabled us to scaffold conversations with people in rural villages. And just to kind of highlight the ways in which these are culturally relevant, and Karel had a major role in all of this, the map that you see there is the map that is commonly taught in schools. Or we use images of these basic feature phones because those are the types of phones that people in rural villages are most familiar with, less smartphones and definitely not iPhones, for example. And then these visuals were really low tech. And so we were able to kind of bring them out with us in the field. And one of the things that I think was very cool was that participants often would pick them up and they would start manipulating them and using them to help explain their own ideas. And so by using the visuals, I think oftentimes participants were actually able to express their own ideas in ways that probably would not have been possible without the use of these visuals. And so in interviews, we would often use these visuals to help explain what mobile phone metadata is, what data is contained within the metadata, and then would ask people how sensitive or not that information was. So what did we find? What did we learn? I'm gonna tell you a story in a moment, but before I tell you a story, I wanna give you sort of the high level takeaway of what we found, which is that our experiential experts were really concerned about the privacy harms that could arise if mobile phone data was revealed to people who were near to them, close by. So they raised these sort of much more relational privacy concerns that were tied to things like shame and jealousy, or the ways in which if people nearby to them learn certain pieces of data, it could really limit their autonomy. And to me, this is a really different set of privacy concerns than the types of privacy concerns that are commonly being talked about by domain experts in the literature. But now I want to tell you a story. And this is a story about a man named Simbila, and that is a pseudonym. And it's a story that actually takes place almost exactly 1 year ago to the day. I think it was March 25th or something last year. And it takes place in Togo, in the northern part of the country, in a village that's about a 1-hour car ride from the nearest sort of major city on a mixture of dirt roads and paved roads. And this is where we interview Sumbilo. He's a 38-year-old man, and we interview him right sort of as he's on his way to attend a funeral later that day. And it's really here that we talk with him about his perspective on data privacy, the data privacy concerns that arise from mobile phone data. And so we've just used the visuals that I just showed you to explain to him the information that's recorded in mobile phone data, which you can see in this photo there. And we ask him how sensitive this data is. And Sumbila first starts to think about the people in his village. And he starts thinking about how the data recorded in mobile money transactions, which in his view could reveal very sensitive financial data. He said that he wouldn't want other people in his village to know this information. And so he says, quote, "The one who gives mobile money could be harmed if it is known in the community, because it is known that he has money and gives it to others. Some may be jealous of him, but the one receiving may feel some kind of shame. People in the community will have a bad opinion of him because he depends on other people to survive." And this was emblematic. Many people spoke to us about the ways in which this kind of data could reveal things that could bring about shame or jealousy. And then we ask him, you know, let's not think about people in your community. How would you feel if the exact same data was revealed to the government of Togo? How would you feel? And he tells us, "I won't be disturbed if the Togo government knows about mobile money balances and transactions. They know that you're helping others. But among ourselves here, it may be disturbing. The government could know because they can't envy me." And so again, Sumbila's sort of response is really emblematic of many of the people we interviewed, where they were really focused on sort of the types of privacy harms that were much more relational, were tied to shame and jealousy and the ways in which this data could really limit their autonomy. And they were much less concerned about sort of the data being revealed to people who are far away and the types of privacy concerns that could arise. So how do we make sense of this? So again, like, you know, we sort of find that, again, in my mind, these are two very different definitions or framings of privacy. And ultimately, what we argue in the paper is that it's not that sort of one of these is right and the other one is wrong, but rather that they're both pointing to two very different ideas about privacy that are both really, really important to consider. But ultimately, that sort of each expert is surfacing a type or a set of privacy concerns that are largely out of view to the other. So the privacy concerns that are being raised by our experiential experts are largely out of view to the domain experts. And similarly, the concerns of the domain experts are sort of largely out of view of our experiential experts. And what we kind of argue is not that one of these perspectives is right and the other one is wrong, and that, you know, we only need to pick one, but rather that perhaps the picture should look something more like this, where we think about bringing different types of experts and expertise together as a way of surfacing different types of privacy concerns. I think it's kind of interesting when we were talking initially about the title for this paper, we had initially called it like divergent data privacy, thinking about the kind of contrast between these perspectives. And then it was like realizing that sets up a little bit too much of the tension, whereas really we see them as stronger together and really complementary with one another. And so I kind of return to this question that I posed at the beginning, which is like, does it matter? Do we need to engage people with experiential expertise in our understanding about the types of privacy concerns that arise from mobile phone data? Hopefully I've convinced you that the answer is yes, in part because they surface a very different type and different set of privacy concerns. And to me, as someone who's like very interested in designing new sorts of solutions that can really, you know, enable these new opportunities that data provides while also protecting and thinking carefully about privacy, this is super important because robust solutions have to address a wide range of these different types of privacy concerns. And in the paper, and again, for the sake of time, I won't go into this in depth, but happy to talk more about it. we end the paper by talking a bit about sort of design implications using two case studies, one of which is thinking about data sovereignty models, and the other is thinking about poverty prediction for aid allocation as a way to kind of play out why it's so important to consider the privacy concerns raised by domain experts and experiential experts. That if we only thought about the privacy concerns of one and not the other, we would design solutions that quite clearly would raise significant privacy concerns. So with that, I am happy to take questions. Again, Corral, if you have any comments, you should totally feel free to put them in chat. Or if people have questions for Corral, I encourage you to reach out to her. She's great. Yeah, Anna.
There's a great model of what you learned from qualitative research that I really appreciate. I'm curious if you could just dig in a little bit more on the design implications, like how would that be useful to poverty prediction for aid allocation?
Yeah, so, okay, these slides I just made and I'm not like super thrilled with them, but I think that they will start to kind of get at it. So we just sort of play this out like a little bit hypothetically, but you could imagine that if you were very concerned about the types of privacy concerns that are being raised by domain experts, you would think about different types of solutions. Like you might think about data, like technical approaches to protecting privacy, like differential privacy. How do you make the data differentially private? You might think about like different models for data sovereignty to enable consent, right? Like maybe the data really should belong and should be like owned, let's say, by the people so that they really know how their data is used or not used. And I think that starts to address like surveillance and it starts to address some of these technical privacy concerns. But if you only did that and you didn't think about the sorts of privacy concerns being raised by experiential experts, you could design a system that actually brought people a lot of shame or jealousy. And you know, one of the things that we talk about a little bit in the paper too is like just like finances in general are really, really sensitive and beyond sort of like digital data just in general. And so you could imagine like if you are, you know, designing an app or, you know, like an interface, and there's so much people share phones all the time. And so if it reveals financial information and you're not thinking about how are you designing that system and how are you designing the interface and how are you communicating about the program, then you could leave open all of these sorts of privacy harms related to shame and jealousy. But similarly, right, if you only focus on the sorts of privacy concerns that are being raised by experiential experts, you potentially really leave open these huge issues around surveillance and consent. And so seeing them as like, you know, we really need to take both of them seriously and they're pointing to really different solutions and yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I agree that like to paint these as distinct is maybe not productive. And so I'm curious, can you imagine like in your ideal case scenario, what would an interface look like that took into consideration the concerns from both these sets of experts? Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question. So another finding that's a different paper that I'm like is very much in progress. Because we also, one set of the interviews that I did was specifically about data privacy, and the other part was about people's experience with No VC, which was like the cash transfer program. And one of the things that I found that was I thought really, really interesting is that there's a lot in order to register for No VC requires significant different types of literacy, shall we say, right? You need to be able to read and write, you have to use your phone, you have to have a phone that works. And so a lot of people were not able to register on their own. And so there became these like key people within the villages who ended up helping. Like I interviewed one person who said he helped over 500 people register for this program. And what was really interesting is that he describes the experiences on the one hand feeling like a hero. He's like, this is amazing. Like I'm able to help 500 like people in my community access this resource. And then he also said that it was really painful because he had to be the bearer of bad news often, right? You can think about like the training doctors receive to like tell people bad medical news, but he's just a random person in the community. He doesn't have any additional knowledge about the program, right? And he's being put in this position of having to tell people that they didn't receive something. And then he would often get accused of stealing. And so I think there's a really interesting design space to start to think about. There are things I think in the kind of, you know, interface that one could think about doing. So for example, you could think about registration processes that have more pattern recognition. So like people become familiar with, I know I have to click up here and then I have to click down here. And so I can start to memorize like what the registration pattern would be like. So that's like one thing you could think about, but you could also think about like ways of formalizing this role of the intermediary, right? Or you could think about the ways in which radio broadcasts could be used to provide explanations about the program in ways that like provide these intermediaries with more, more tools in some sense to enable them to feel like a hero and to kind of mitigate the concerns that arise. So I think that there's like a whole design space where some of it potentially is around the interface, and then some of it is this like kind of broader solution space to think with. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could use some examples like from a much less technical but similar thing that happened in the framework of aid in general, like for example, like in the United States, like with the SNAP.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Food stamps, whatnot.
Yeah.
At some point, like they were given something that looked like
Yeah.
you will know that you have food
Yeah.
stamps, and then they made it like a
Yeah.
big house so people wouldn't be ashamed.
Yeah.
So it would be nice to see how they went about it, what made the decision, and if that framework can
Yeah.
actually be applied here.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's like a great example that we mentioned in the paper. And I think is like also a really great example of the ways in which like, so part of the reason I also use this language around experiential experts is I'm like pretty opposed to this like Western, non-Western, or like global North, global South framing. And in part, it's because of this, like finances are like, is really sensitive data and information the world around, right? And we see that like in these anti-poverty programs, both in the US and abroad, that people won't use and won't try and access poverty, these anti-poverty initiatives if they feel like it will bring them shame or it will bring them stigma. And that's, true around the world. So I think that's like a great example. Yeah, and also a really great example of these like fairly simple things I think that can be done to both like increase the program's effectiveness and the experience for beneficiaries. Cool. Thank you all.